The bright studio lights of Good Morning America shone down on the glass desk, reflecting off the polished surface as cameras zoomed in. Brad Pitt sat opposite George Stephanopoulos, his trademark half-smile in place, though his eyes hinted at a quiet tension. George shuffled his notes, clearing his throat as the intro music faded. "Brad, it's great to have you here," George began warmly. "You've got a new film coming out, and it's already generating quite a bit of buzz." Brad nodded, leaning slightly forward. "Yeah, I'm proud of this one. We worked hard, and I think it says something important." But George didn't linger on the movie. "Speaking of important," he said, his tone shifting just a hair, "your recent comments about Hollywood politics have caused a stir. Some people say they were divisive." Brad's smile thinned. "I think I was just being honest. If that's divisive, then maybe we need more of it." George raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at the control booth. "Honest, maybe. But some feel you crossed a line, especially when you mentioned certain industry figures by name." "I said what I said," Brad replied evenly, his voice tightening. "It's not personal. It's about the system. But I'm not here to apologize for telling the truth." The studio's atmosphere thickened. A few crew members exchanged glances behind the cameras. George pressed on. "Brad, don't you think making sweeping statements about colleagues on live TV undermines the kind of unity you've spoken about in the past?" Brad leaned back, folding his arms. "Unity doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean pretending everything's fine when it's not. If we're all just smiling and nodding, nothing changes." The exchange, still polite on the surface, had a current running underneath, sharp, tense, and steadily heating. The audience at home could feel it, even if they couldn't see the small twitch in George's jaw or the way Brad's foot began tapping under the desk. By the time the segment's first break was signaled, the energy had shifted. Brad's earlier ease was gone, replaced by a readiness to push back, and George, mind still outwardly calm, looked like he was preparing for a much more pointed second half. The cameras rolled back to life after the commercial break, the cheerful GMA theme music feeling almost ironic given the tension simmering at the desk. Brad Pitt adjusted his blazer, glancing toward the crew as if to confirm they were live again. George Stephanopoulos smiled at the camera, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "So, Brad," George began, voice calm but edged, "before the break, you spoke about the need for honesty in Hollywood. Let's talk specifics. You recently called out certain studios for what you called hypocrisy masked as progress. Care to elaborate?" Brad shifted in his seat. "Sure. Some people in this industry love to give speeches about fairness and equality. But behind the scenes, they're doing the exact opposite. I've seen it. I've lived it. And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't happen." George leaned in, pressing. "But don't you think making those kinds of accusations without naming sources damages your credibility?" Brad's jaw flexed. "My credibility isn't the issue here. The issue is people getting away with things because everyone's too scared to speak up." The control booth lit up with activity, producers exchanging rapid notes, one of them gesturing urgently toward George. It was clear they wanted him to push harder. George didn't hesitate. "Brad, some would argue you've benefited enormously from the very system you're criticizing. Isn't that a little contradictory?" Brad's eyes narrowed. "So because I've been successful, I'm not allowed to call out the flaws? That's convenient. That's how the system stays broken. People in my position stay quiet so they don't lose their place at the table." A tense silence followed, only broken by the faint hum of the studio lights. George tapped his pen against the desk, his tone cooling further. "You understand you're making some serious claims on national television. Are you prepared to back them up with proof?" Brad gave a short laugh, but it wasn't amused. "Proof? I've got more than proof. I've got 25 years of watching the game being rigged. But I'm not here to name names, not yet." Somewhere off camera, a floor manager ran a hand over his face, clearly sensing the interview had veered into dangerous territory. The energy was no longer just tense. It was crackling, unpredictable, and both men knew it. By the time the next segment began, the studio air felt charged, as if every breath could spark something combustible. George Stephanopoulos leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk while Brad Pitt sat straighter, no longer bothering with his trademark charm. "Brad," George started, voice sharper now, "you've been hinting at corruption, hypocrisy, even dishonesty in this industry. Without names or evidence, aren't you just throwing mud for publicity?" Brad's head tilted, his expression hardening. Publicity? If I wanted publicity, I'd just smile, tell a few anecdotes, and plug my movie. But maybe that's what you'd prefer, George. Keep it light, keep it safe. George didn't flinch. I'd prefer facts over insinuations. Millions of people are watching. Words have consequences. Brad leaned in, matching George's tone. Exactly. And maybe if more people realized that, we'd stop letting power hide behind polite conversations like this one. The exchange had shifted from tense to openly combative. The crew froze behind the cameras, eyes darting between the two men like they were watching a car accelerate toward a wall. George's voice took on that firm, news anchor cadence he used when holding political guests accountable. Brad, are you accusing specific Hollywood executives of wrongdoing? Brad's lips pressed into a thin line before he spoke. I'm saying there's a lot of people cashing in on an image they don't live by. And the moment someone says it out loud, they get labeled as difficult, unstable, or, he gestured vaguely toward George, out for publicity. Or, George countered, they get asked to back up what they're saying, which you still haven't done. A visible flash of irritation crossed Brad's face. I'm not here to be cross-examined, George. You invited me here to talk about my film, and instead you're trying to turn this into some gotcha moment. George's voice stayed level, but his eyes were cold. We invited you here to talk honestly. You've made serious claims. I'm just giving you the opportunity to stand by them. Brad gave a short, bitter laugh. I've stood by them my whole career, but maybe the truth doesn't fit into your morning show format. The control booth's chatter turned urgent. A producer's voice crackled into George's earpiece. Wrap it up, now. But as both men locked eyes, neither seemed ready to back down. The tension in the Good Morning America studio had shifted from a slow simmer to a full boil, even through the camera's tight framing. Viewers at home could feel it. The clipped tones, the stiff posture, the way George Stephanopoulos' pen no longer rested on the desk but tapped in sharp, deliberate beats. George cleared his throat. Brad, I'm going to ask you one last time. Do you have the evidence to support your accusations? Or are these just personal grievances? Brad leaned back, crossing his arms. You can call them whatever you want. I call it reality. And if you don't want to hear it, maybe your viewers do. George's smile tightened into something almost imperceptible. We have a responsibility to our audience to provide credible, verifiable information, not vague claims. Brad shot back, voice rising just a fraction. And maybe you have a responsibility to stop protecting the people who sign your checks. The words landed like a slap. A couple of crew members visibly winced. The control booth erupted in chatter. Someone gestured frantically toward the floor manager, who took a hesitant step toward the set. George's tone went cold. Brad, I think we're done here. Brad smirked. Afraid I might say something that can't be edited out? Before George could respond, the floor manager stepped fully into view, hand raised. We're going to end the segment now. The camera stayed on, capturing every movement. George shuffled his papers, pretending to transition to the next guest. But Brad's voice cut through. Of course. Silence the guy who won't play along. Classic morning TV. Brad, George started. But the floor manager had already leaned toward him, whispering something. Moments later, 2 security staff entered quietly from the side of the set. Brad stood slow and deliberate, adjusting his jacket. Guess that's my cue. He glanced toward the cameras, giving a small, almost mocking wave. Enjoy the rest of the show, folks. The crew avoided his gaze as he strode off, the faint squeak of his shoes echoing in the sudden hush. The security staff didn't touch him, but their presence was a clear escort. As the studio doors swung closed behind him, George turned back to the camera, his voice smoothing into the professional calm of someone, pretending nothing unusual had happened. We'll be right back after the break. The red light above the camera went dark, but the room stayed frozen, the shock still thick in the air.